All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 5 of the course. As you can tell, I made it back in one piece in time for class tonight. So I really did want to make sure I got back here in time so we could have class. I really did not want to cancel any of our classes. So I do think we'll probably do a somewhat abbreviated session tonight because, again, I did just get back and I'm trying to figure out which way is up. So what we are going to do tonight is, first off, thank you for everyone who has turned in the alternative solutions paper. I know a few have come in. I haven't gotten to all the ones that have come in, obviously, but I did get a chance while I was on the road to check out a couple of the ones that came in early and provide some feedback on those. And so far, so good. I think those papers that I reviewed are all very good. The grades are 90 plus. And I think everyone did a nice job of identifying 3 reasonable, pragmatic alternatives, and then did a nice job of discussing actors involved and the implementation prospects for those 3 different alternatives. So if you haven't turned in the alternative solutions paper yet, please make sure to do that by midnight tonight. Hopefully after class tonight, I'll be able to get to a few more of the papers that have already been submitted, and then I will reserve a good portion of the day tomorrow, several hours tomorrow, to then review the remaining papers and try and get those papers back to you along with some feedback. Hopefully, if everything goes well, by tomorrow evening, but we will see how all of that goes. For your number 4, your essay, Canvas essay on the mission and values of the organization, I reviewed all of those as well. I didn't provide much feedback on those because I really wanted to really focus my feedback on the alternative solutions paper. So that's why I didn't give a lot of feedback on this most recent Canvas essay, but read through those and provided a grade on those that have come in up to this point in time. For the most part, I think I've gotten most of them done. For this week, your next Canvas essay looks at these models of effectiveness that we talked about last week. And again, I thought it was important last week for us to go through these 4 different models of effectiveness, just so I knew that we covered the information in case we weren't able to have class tonight. But since we are having class tonight, I thought we would just really quickly go through those 4 different models again, just as a refresher, because for your next Canvas essay, that's what you're going to be talking about, is you're going to be telling me about the model of organizational effectiveness that you see used most commonly in your organization, basically how your organization is defining and measuring effectiveness. To help you write that Canvas essay, then also tonight, once we get done with our material, we'll do our breakout groups as we normally do. And one of the topics for the breakout groups tonight will be identifying the model of organizational effectiveness that your group sees in your organization. So it'll just kind of help you in writing that next Canvas essay. So for this week, it's a pretty light lift, if you will, in that you just have your Canvas essay that is then due. And then next week, when we get together, we will talk about motivation, and we'll devote the entire session next Monday to just a discussion of motivation, different motivational strategies, theories of motivation, and how motivation has then a positive impact, obviously, on productivity and the effectiveness of the organization. So tonight we'll review our models of effectiveness again. Then I also want to present some information on decision-making and the relationship between how organizations make their decisions and the achievement of effectiveness. Then we'll finish up tonight, as we normally do, with our breakout groups. So that's where we are tonight. That's where we're going. So any questions or anything before we jump into our topic for tonight? Okay. All right. Very good. Again, I apologize. I just got back, and so I'm going to try and be as on point as possible tonight. But you probably all know, I'm sure you're all very well aware of the struggles of traveling these days, and so it sometimes takes a while to get your feet back on the ground, both literally as well as figuratively. But last week we did talk about these 4 different models that you are now very well aware of: the goal attainment model, the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model. Throughout our discussion last week over these 4 different models, we presented each one and talked a little bit about each one and the way in which they define and measure effectiveness. We start our discussion obviously with the goal approach model, the goal attainment model, and in the goal attainment model we talked about obviously it's the most direct, the simplest way to measure effectiveness. How well did we achieve our goals? Now, what progress have we made toward the achievement of our goals? But we know in order to use the goal attainment model, we need to have a good, clear definition of what our goals are. And those definitions of our goals need to be accepted throughout the entire organization. Sometimes our goals are a little bit more amorphous than we would like for them to be. And if we have very vague and ambiguous goals, obviously the goal attainment approach may be a little bit difficult. It is a very rational and very orderly process in that we are looking in a very linear way at the relationship between what the organization is doing and the way in which it's be able to achieve its goals. We said some of the drawbacks of the goal attainment approach is that life is not always linear. There's not always a linear relationship between we do this over here and it results in this. And because life is not always linear, the goal attainment approach doesn't always take into consideration conflict between goals, doesn't really take into account always different types of goals, official versus operative goals, doesn't take into account complicating factors such as the hierarchy of the organization, sometimes the culture of the organization. And so sometimes it's a little bit too simplistic for what we need to do in defining and measuring effectiveness. But as we said, it is the most common way in which we define effectiveness in our public organizations. When the goal attainment model is not possible, or if we want to complement the goal attainment model with another approach, we then present the second approach, the systems resource approach. We talked about that as being very much akin to open systems theory and authors like Katz and Kahn, whereby we measure our effectiveness as an organization by our ability to import energy and import resources from our external environment. That importation of resources from our external environment, the importation of energy from the external environment, we said is very similar to this negative entropy concept of open systems theory, whereby we don't always just dissipate energy and go out of existence as agencies. We can actually renew ourselves and revitalize ourselves by importing and obtaining those surplus resources from outside of the walls of the organization. We said the basic way in which we're going to measure that is longitudinally. We'll look at the resources we have at the beginning point, and then a later point, a longitudinal study will then measure the resources. If we've seen an increase in augmentation of those resources, that then can be an indicator of effectiveness. Again, it can be somewhat difficult to measure. Sometimes it's difficult to quantify the types of resources that we are pulling in from our external environment. You know, we identified some of the very basic types of resources we get, like a labor pool, an educated and ready-to-work labor pool, things such as appropriations, money for our organization, political support. You know, money is very easy to measure. Political support could be a little bit more difficult for us to measure. And so some of our measurements are not quite as quantitative and objective as we may like for them to be in this systems resource type of approach. We said the systems resource approach typically gets used when you're not able to do a goal attainment approach. So if you don't have those clear goals, this is just another way that you can define effectiveness within your organization. Then we offered up a third model of effectiveness, which is the participant satisfaction model. And we said the participant satisfaction model, we're basically measuring effectiveness by how satisfied our core constituencies, our core stakeholders are. With the participant satisfaction model, we said, it can work in a couple of different ways. If we are looking at keeping our constituents satisfied outside of the organization, then the participant satisfaction model is starting to bleed over into the systems resource open systems type of an approach. Because we're looking beyond the walls of the organization, we are looking external to the organization. Idea being that obviously if we can keep those core constituencies satisfied, then they will be more supportive of what we are doing as an organization, which then leads to more money, more political support, and all those great things. We said the internal dimension of the participant satisfaction model, we look inside the organization at the satisfaction level of our employees within the organization, which kind of makes it give it a bit more of a human resource type of feel to it once you are looking at keeping your internal constituencies satisfied. For the participant satisfaction model, we can look at both external constituencies as well as internal stakeholders within the organization. But we're measuring effectiveness as how well we are meeting the needs, how satisfied our constituents are. Then we talked about a fourth model, the internal process model. And we said the internal process model is just what it sounds like. We look internal to the organization. We look at our daily processes in the organization. We look at how positive the work climate is. We look at there's an esprit de corps among our employees, our system of communication, which a lot of people are looking at in their papers, the amount of trust, which is a predicate to communication, the decision-making process, what we'll talk about tonight, and where decision-making occurs. So we went through all these different indicators of what a healthy internal process may look like. And then once we present those four approaches, we also then highlight the fact that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They can be used in combination with each other to complement each other, and your organization may use multiple approaches for defining effectiveness. We also talked about this competing values framework from Quinn and Rohrbach to kind of give us a basic way in which we can find the thread that ties these different models of effectiveness together. We say we can compare these four different models of effectiveness based upon their internal versus external focus, and also their flexibility versus control. So on that x-axis, you have on the left side those models that are focused internal to the organization, are looking at effectiveness within the organization. On the right side, those that are focused more externally to the organization. At the top of the chart, those that favor more flexibility. At the bottom of the chart, those that favor more of a top-down type of control-based mechanism. And then we talked about the rational goal model on this chart being similar to that goal attainment model, that first model we talked about. Systems resource model being similar to that in the top right-hand corner, the open systems model. We said participant satisfaction model will depend. If we're looking inside our organization, it becomes kind of a human relations, human resource type of an approach. If we're looking outside our organization, it becomes much more of an open systems type of orientation. And at the bottom left, we have our internal process model, looking within the organization, internal focus, with the emphasis really placed upon controlling these processes. And if you have good, effective processes in place, these good, effective processes then will hopefully lead to effective outcomes and effective outputs. And so again, we just kind of present this Quinn and Rohrbach competing values framework as a way of just finding that thread to kind of tie these four different models of effectiveness together. Now again, the presentation of these four different models of effectiveness, this is not the universe of all the different ways you can measure effectiveness in an organization, but these are kind of the four most common ways in which we're going to define and measure organizational effectiveness. When we are defining and measuring effectiveness, obviously we are making decisions. We're making decisions about what we consider to be effective. We're making decisions about how we're going to achieve that effectiveness. We're making decisions about, in our internal processes, what we're doing on a daily basis, how we're going about the day-to-day tasks of creating the output that hopefully will lead to the outcome that will meet the needs of our constituents. And we've identified our output is what we are producing in terms of our goods and services and our programs. The outcomes are then the consequences that are then occurring for those who are consuming those outputs. Hopefully, we'll be creating an effective output that will then lead to effective outcomes and consequences. So let's talk a bit about the ways in which decisions are made in organizations and how those decision-making models can have an impact upon organizational effectiveness. And again, when we talk about decision-making models, it's similar to everything else we've talked about throughout this entire course over the past 5 weeks. We're presenting a lot of different models and theories and concepts, but we're never looking for the quote-unquote best approach. We're always looking for the most appropriate approach. And so decision-making models, we'll present 4 of them that you've probably run into before. We'll present those 4 tonight. We're not looking to try and pick the best decision-making model, but rather we're looking to try and select the most appropriate one for the organization and the setting in which we find ourselves. One of the old adages about public administration is that public administration is time-bound, but it is also what we call floating in the seas of time. And so it is very much a practice that is governed by when we are making those decisions and where we are making those decisions. What Mary Parker Follett would tell us, situational leadership and management. So the first decision-making model, I'm sure you are all very familiar with, and that's rational comprehensive decision-making. So just quickly, someone tell me about rational comprehensive decision-making. How does rational comprehensive decision-making work? Again, as always, you can use text chat, you can use the microphone, however you're comfortable participating, but what's rational decision-making? If we're going to be rational about something, what do we do?
This is Amber. Basically, just collect all the information that you can. Well, establish your goals. Collect the information, all the information that you can to support your goals, and use the information to come to a rational conclusion, a logical conclusion. I mean, not to.
Right. Absolutely, yeah, Amber, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's we establish our goals, and we're trying to establish our goals as clearly as we possibly can. Then we're going to go out there and be rational. To use the word to define it, that's fine. We're going to be rational. We're going to go out there and collect all the information that's available, assess and analyze all that information, and then use that information in order to try and make the rational and comprehensive, they would call it the best decision possible. It is data informed, as I see in text chat. Just analyze it, try to determine outcomes, decide what would be best. And so even though, when we're selecting a decision-making model, we want to select the most appropriate one. Here in rational comprehensive, the authors do use the word best because they assume if you're collecting all the possible information out there, then you're going to be able to generate the best solution and select that best solution. So as I said, in rational comprehensive, the steps that we go through. The first step, as was said, we clearly identify our goals. And so we clearly identify what we are trying to achieve, and we gain agreement among our stakeholders on here are the goals that we are trying to achieve. Now, obviously, if you're not able to clearly define your goals and gain agreement on those goals, it's going to be difficult for you to truly be rational and comprehensive in your decision-making process. We clearly identify our goals. Then once we identify those goals, we are going to collect all the information that is out there. So we're going to go out there and collect all the information that is relevant to trying to achieve this goal for the purpose of putting together a full range of alternatives or a full range of solutions to a problem, if you will. So if you think about the way in which we've structured the assignments in this class, if you were going to apply rational comprehensive decision-making to your alternative solutions paper, you wouldn't just have 3 illustrative solutions. I mean, you would have every possible solution out there, every possible alternative. You would generate that whole full list, that full range of alternatives. And then after analyzing all those alternatives, you will then select the best alternative or the best solution to the problem, and you will then implement that single best solution. And that's what we consider to be rational comprehensive decision-making. The advantages are clear in rational comprehensive decision-making. Since we are collecting all the available information out there and we're putting together a full range of alternative solutions, we're going to be able to select the best one because we've thought of everything. We've thought of every single solution. So it is rational, it is comprehensive. That's the primary advantage. Whenever you're rational in your decision-making in an organization, it can help you from creating and committing the same errors year after year after year. If you think about the way in which we put our public budgets together, we are usually not rational in the way in which we put our budgets together. Typically, this year's budget will reflect what we did last year, but with a small incremental augmentation in the amount of money that we are spending on it. So here's what we did last year. We're going to propose doing it again this year, but we're going to spend an extra 2 or 3% this year compared to last year to kind of keep up with inflation and the cost of doing business. That's usually how we put our budgets together. We rarely are rational in that we go back and look at our programs and ask the basic question, the fundamental question, should we continue funding this program? We oftentimes don't do that because that would be rationality. And we don't do it because, number one, it's time consuming, it's resource consuming, it's a very costly way and a very time intensive way to make our decisions. And also, as Herbert Simon tells us, in a lot of respects, we are unable to be rational because we are human beings. And these are decisions that are being made by human beings. Human beings, by definition, have what Simon says is bounded rationality. There are cognitive limitations that people experience. All of our decision makers have cognitive limitations. There's only so much information that we can identify and collect and analyze. So because of those cognitive limitations and that bounded rationality, we oftentimes cannot be purely rational in our decision-making in our organizations. What we'll tend to see is we'll tend to see glimmers of rationality. And so at times we will go back and look at our programs and we will ask the question, should we really still be funding this program? That's a glimmer of rationality. But the vast majority of our decisions are not made using rational, comprehensive decision-making. The vast majority of our decisions in a public organization are made using incrementalism. And I'm sure in the program up to this point, you've probably been introduced to Charles Lindblom and Charles Lindblom's writing on incrementalism. Lindblom, many years ago, received great accolades for an article that he wrote where he talked about this difference between rational, comprehensive decision-making and incrementalism. And Lindblom, when he got all of these accolades, basically said he didn't deserve them. He said he really didn't deserve all these rewards and all this attention because all he was doing in his article, where he compared rationality to incrementalism, is just explain what happens on a daily basis in our organizations. And Lindblom said, we're usually not rational, but instead we're much more incremental in the way in which we make our decisions. And if you've read Charles Lindblom, which you probably already have, you know the difference between the root and the branch approach. The root approach to decision-making is rational, comprehensive decision-making. The branch approach, according to Lindblom, is incrementalism. So we never really get to the root of the problem. We never really get down to the basic root of the problem. Instead, we're dealing out there in those branches with small incremental changes, small marginal changes to what we are doing on a daily basis. So incrementalism, thanks to Charles Lindblom, is our second primary model of decision-making in our organizations. Obviously, incrementalism is a much more limited way of making decisions as compared to rational, comprehensive decision-making. In rational, comprehensive decision-making, we could clearly identify our goals. In incrementalism, we oftentimes cannot clearly identify our goals, and we cannot get clear agreement on what those goals really are. In incrementalism, our goals and the means or alternatives for achieving those goals are oftentimes intertwined. And while one person will say, well, this is a way of achieving the goal, this is a strategy for achieving the goal, another person may say, well, that strategy is a goal in and of itself. And so when you have your goals and your strategies that are so intertwined, you can't get agreement on what's a goal and what's a strategy, it's going to be really difficult for you to use rational, comprehensive decision-making. So you have these intertwined, unclear, or kind of muddy goals and strategies. We go out there and we collect not all the available information because we realize we have bounded rationality. So within the bounds of our rationality and our cognitive limitations, we will instead collect very limited information. So we'll go out there and we'll analyze all the information we are able to analyze as human beings. We have cognitive limitations, we have time limitations, we have cost limitations. We're just not going to be able to be purely rational in collecting all the possible information. If we are not capable of collecting all of the possible information, by definition, it means that we are not going to be able to say with confidence that we are putting together a full range of alternatives for solving our problem or achieving our goal. Rather than a full range of alternatives, we're going to put together a much more limited range of alternatives. So we may not have thousands upon thousands of different alternatives. We may have a handful. We may have a dozen at the most alternatives that we are going to be selecting between. So it's a limited range of alternatives. From that limited range of alternatives, we will select the alternative that works for us. It may not be the best alternative, and we cannot say it is the best alternative because the best alternative is something we may not have thought of. It may still be floating around out there in the ether. We haven't had the time or the cognitive ability or the resources to go out there and find it. So we're never going to be able to say with 100% confidence that the alternative we're selecting is the best one. What we will be able to say is we believe with confidence this alternative will work and hopefully will help us achieve our goal. It's kind of similar to when you do research and social science research. We're never 100% confident. We're happy with a 95% confidence level. That's kind of the conventional standard in social science research, because there are so many other things out there that we cannot control, and all these other things that we cannot think of. We can never be 100% confident. Natural scientists can be a lot more confident because they can control their experiments. They can control the variables that they are dealing with. They get underneath the hood, and under that hood, they control that environment. And so they can be a lot more confident about relationships. We cannot be quite as confident in the social sciences for this same reason. So we select the alternative, oftentimes the first alternative that works for us. And that first alternative that works for us then becomes our policy solution. That then becomes the way in which we are going to achieve our goal, the way in which we are going to become effective at achieving our goal. And we then implement that first alternative that works for us. Clearly, it's a more realistic way of making decisions. Clearly, it's a less costly and less time intensive and less cognitive resource intensive way of making decisions, but also the disadvantage, it's not rational. So we may have missed the best alternative out there. And so what we are implementing may not be the best way in order to solve that problem. It's an appropriate way, but it's not necessarily the best way. Lynn Bloom obviously argued, as you know, that this is the way we make our decisions typically in our public organizations. And it's certainly the way in which we do budget making. This is how we do our budgets. So the vast majority of our budgets, unless we're doing something like zero-based budgeting or an approach like that, the vast majority of our budgets are going to be constructed using incrementalism. If you do a lot of work in budgeting, if you've had a budgeting course, the different types of budget formats. A line item budget is the most common type of budget we see, especially at the local level of government. Line item budgeting is incrementalism at its best. A zero-based budget where we go back and we actually ask those hard questions about whether or not we should be funding this program. We ask those questions about comparing all these different decision packages. That's a more rational way of decision making. But we do a lot more incrementalism, a lot more line item budgeting than we do rationality and zero-based budgeting. So rational comprehensive and incrementalism are kind of at those polar opposites of the spectrum. Now, if we want to be very, very confident that we are going to be effective at achieving our goals, we want to try and incorporate more rationality into our decision making. But more rationality takes more time, and it takes more effort, and it takes more resources. The third decision-making model that I usually like to talk about is a combination of the two. So it's where we combine, hopefully, the best of incrementalism with the best of rational comprehensive. And that's a decision-making model known as mixed scanning. And mixed scanning comes to us from an author whose name I like to say, and that's Etzioni. His name is Amitai Etzioni, which is just a great name, kind of rolls off the tongue, but Amitai Etzioni in his model of mixed scanning. Etzioni argues in mixed scanning that we will use either rationality or incrementalism depending upon the magnitude and the scope of the problem we are dealing with. So how important is this decision that we are making? If it's a very important decision, we'll use rational comprehensive. We'll invest the time and we'll invest the resources and the effort to collect as many alternative solutions as we can and be as rational as we can possibly be, because that will give us a better chance of being effective in achieving our goals. If it's a small issue, a very mundane day-to-day operational issue, then we're probably going to use incrementalism, because we don't want to invest all the time and the resources and the effort into being rational for very mundane day-to-day type of issues. So, reordering supplies, reordering staples for our office. Pretty basic mundane issue. We can be incremental. We look at how much we purchased last month, look at our workload, and then make that decision how much we're going to purchase for this coming month. Very simple, very quick way of making decisions. It makes a lot of sense that we'll look at the scope of the decision and then be rational for big momentous decisions and then incremental for more mundane decisions. You see this type of mixed scanning oftentimes in the difference between operating and capital budgets. So in operating budgets for our day-to-day functions of our organization, most of the time we're going to use line item budgeting. We're going to be very incremental, because a lot of the expenditures that we're going to make this year are similar to the expenditures we made last year and the year before that, the year before that. After all, 90% of our budget is going to be devoted to personnel, to staffing, for salaries and benefits. And so that's a relatively static type of calculation. So in our operating budget, we tend to be very incremental. However, when it comes to our capital budget, we tend to be more rational in nature, because with that capital budget, we're talking about projects that have a very high price tag. So maybe construction of a city hall, construction of a recreation center. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to be a multi-generational project that if you're going to construct a building, you hope that building will be there for decades and decades to come if you properly maintain it. So you're going to have a lot of future generations that are going to be using that building. You're probably going to finance the construction of that building through borrowing money. You're probably going to issue debt. Well, that debt is going to have long maturity dates. And so that debt may be a 20-year bond, a 30-year bond. A lot of local governments are using 40-year bonds. So it's something you're going to be living with for a very long time. So with our capital budgets and the creation of our capital improvement plans, we tend to try and be more rational in nature. So we'll do a needs assessment. We'll look at the current state of our physical plant. We will look at the amount of revenue that we have available, and then we'll prioritize which of these projects get funded in which year of our capital improvement plan. And then, each year the capital improvement plan then becomes that year's capital budget. But we're being very rational in the way in which you're making these decisions. Several years ago, my school district, we had a $148 million general obligation bond. It was a Prop 39 general obligation bond. And Prop 39 general obligation bonds are school district specific general obligation bonds that you can pass with only a 55% voter approval. Here in California, typically general obligation bonds, because they do commit the full faith and credit of the city or the government to repay the debt, usually require a 2/3 majority of voters in order to pass that type of general obligation bond. Proposition 39 allowed school districts to have general obligation bonds passed with only a 55% voter majority. So we passed this $148 million general obligation Prop 39 bond back in 2014. The process we went through in creating that bond and deciding what projects would be funded through that $148 million was a very lengthy and a very time-consuming process. And we put together an education specifications committee. We put together a parent committee, and we put together cluster committees for all the different schools within the clusters of geographic clusters within the district. We had an oversight committee. We had to put together a citizen oversight committee, a COC, because one of the requirements of a Prop 39 bond is, in order to get that 55% voter approval, that lower threshold, you have to create a citizen oversight committee that will do audits and make sure the money is being spent the way in which it's meant to be spent. But there are a lot of moving parts. It was a very rational decision-making process that took many, many months of preparation before we could even go to the voters with that bond, and then many, many years of actually implementing the money, the proceeds from that bond. 148, not to get too budgeting on it, but a $148 million bond can really turn into a much more valuable bond than just $148 million, because you can leverage state money with it. And so when I left the board, I think that $148 million had already been leveraged into almost $200 million because of state money, matching money that could come in to fund the construction and reconstruction of these schools. A good point. That's why smaller districts choose not to use prop money. It's very documentation heavy. They don't have the staff. Absolutely. It is very, very resource intensive to do all the steps that are required in a Prop 39 bond. You have to, have internal staff. You have to hire consultants. You're going to have a bond counsel. You're going to have a financial advisor. You're going to have underwriters. You're going to have your consultants in terms of your architectural consultants. Again, a lot of money, a lot of resources go into these types of bonds. And so, yeah, it's true. Smaller districts that don't have the resources are really kind of limited in their ability to use those types of bonds. But it was a very rational process, because we knew at the end of the day, we were probably going to be looking at about $200 million of capital projects that are going to last for many, many years. And this initial $148 million bond, those GO bonds were 30-year maturity dates. Now, a lot of them have been paid off before that through refunding because of what's happened in the market. Not too long ago, bond rates were hovering down close to 0.5%. Some districts are actually fortunate enough to get bond rates in the negatives, which meant that they were actually making money by borrowing money, which is just a crazy situation. But you're able to leverage that money for a lot more. And so when you're talking about spending $200 million, you want to really take your time and be as rational as possible. So capital budgeting tends to be a lot more rational. Operating budgets tend to be done much more in a line item incremental type of a focus. And so I think there's a good illustration of this idea of mixed scanning. The problem, the disadvantage with mixed scanning is sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder, and sometimes it can be somewhat subjective. So what is one person's small, mundane issue may be another person's very important issue, and vice versa. And so sometimes it's hard to get agreement on what is a small issue and should be done with incrementalism, what is a big, momentous issue that should be done with rational, comprehensive decision-making. And that's the primary criticism of Etzioni's mixed scanning. But that's a third way in which we can make decisions. The fourth model is one you've probably run into before. It's kind of similar, if you had the policy class, to John Kingdon's model of decision-making, a model of policy-making. And that's what's called the garbage can model of decision-making. It's one of my personal favorites because I think it does explain a lot of the ways in which we make decisions, both at a policy level as well as within our organization. So when we're not being incremental, sometimes we're using this thing called garbage can model of decision making. And if you haven't come across garbage can model of decision making, you want some authors to attach to it. Cohen, March, and Olson are three of the authors that are usually attributed to garbage can model of decision making. So how's garbage can model of decision making work? I think it's a great decision making model. I think it's a very appropriate one for a lot of the decisions we make, again, at the policy level as well as within our organizations. I just think I don't like the title because calling it a garbage can model really does kind of lead you down the road of thinking, well, you just throw all this information in the garbage can, shake it up, and see what you get. There's a lot more rhyme and reason to it than just that. So in garbage can model of decision making, essentially we make decisions in our organizations at the confluence of four different streams, quote unquote streams. So basically what the author said is when these four streams of participants, problems, solutions, and choice opportunities, when they converge, when these four streams all flow together, at that point of confluence, that's where our decisions tend to be made. And the type of decision that is made will depend upon the first stream, the participant stream. Who is involved? And so that's why I always ask you in your alternative solutions paper, who are the actors? Who's involved in this solution? Who has a vested interest? Who's a stakeholder in this type of decision? Who's going to be actually involved in making this decision? So this participant stream, we're talking about the decision makers themselves. Do you have the quote unquote right mixture of participants, of decision makers who are predisposed to making a decision or changing the way in which our organization is operating? So do you have the quote unquote right mixture of decision makers? That's your participant stream. If you don't have participants in your participant stream who are predisposed to making a decision, then chances are we're going to revert back to incrementalism. And we're going to just keep maintaining the status quo and just keep doing what we've done in previous years. We know when we do incrementalism and we just continue doing what we've done in previous years, there's always that potential for committing the same errors over and over and over again. We do know, though, when you are rational, then the downside of being rational is making those big mistakes. So in incrementalism, you repeat small mistakes over and over again, and the culmination, the accumulation of all those smaller mistakes is then a big mistake. In rational comprehensive, there's potential of really swinging and missing, so to speak, in the world of baseball and really making a very big mistake. But you got to have those participants in place, people who are predisposed to altering the course and doing something different than what we've done in the past. Then your second stream is your problem stream. And this gets back to the ability to clearly identify and define the problem that you are trying to resolve with this decision, the problem that you are trying to address. And hopefully in this problem stream, you will have a pretty clear agreement on what the problem is. And so your participants are agreeing that, yes, indeed, this is the nature of the problem. Much like with John Kingdon in his policy model, in this problem stream, you have all these different problems that are floating around out there in the organization. So we know these problems are there, we just really haven't done much substantively about them. So when you were writing your background paper, you probably had a myriad of problems that you could select from in your organization. You selected the problem that you thought was most important to your organization or most important to you in your position within that organization. But it certainly is not the only problem in your organization. There are other problems that you could focus on as well. As I said, several people are focusing on ineffective communication as a problem in their organizations. I think we can probably apply that to the majority of organizations that we deal with. So you've got this stream of problems floating around out there. Then you also have a stream of what are called solutions out there. That there are solutions to those problems and they're floating around out there. We don't always create a solution for a given problem. Sometimes in garbage can model decision making, we can reach back in time and select a solution that was developed for a previous problem and apply that solution to our contemporary present day problem. And this is why I say garbage can model decision making, I always refer to it as the Quentin Tarantino type of way of decision making. If you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that they're oftentimes non-sequential. They kind of bounce around all over the place in terms of the chronology and the timeline of the movie. Well, this is kind of similar here. You can have solutions that you're using that have actually predated the problem because they were developed for other problems that were problems decades ago. But you have solutions that can be applied to the problem. And then your fourth stream is what's referred to as the choice opportunity stream. This is similar to what John Kingdon would refer to as a triggering event or a window of opportunity. So something happens, there's some triggering event that allows all these streams to come together that will allow us to then make a decision. I give you a couple of examples of that kind of from the policy world, but one example that I oftentimes use in my classes is the example of a airline disaster from several years ago called the Value Jet crash. And in the Value Jet crash, there was this plane, this airline known as Value Jet. Value Jet was known for kind of cutting some corners in terms of trying to get the lowest fares possible. And there's a Value Jet that crashed into the Florida Everglades, unfortunately killing almost everyone on board. The problem was that there was a fire that occurred in that jet. But the problem was the fire occurred in the cargo bay, the cargo area of the plane. No one knew, none of the crew knew that the fire was in the cargo bay because there were no smoke detectors. There was no detection mechanism in the cargo bay of the plane. Nothing had been required by the FAA in the cargo bay of the plane. By the time the crew realized that this fire was going, it was too late to save the plane, and unfortunately the plane crashed in the Florida Everglades. Well, with that type of airline disaster, that then becomes a triggering event for us to say there needs to be a change in policy. We need to change the way in which we are doing this. And obviously the solution was an obvious one that had been around for many years, and that was smoke detectors. It's just we needed to legislate smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. And that happened with legislation through Congress. So you kind of had this confluence of you had people in Congress who were willing to make this change and require smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. We had a problem. We knew what the problem was. We had no way of detecting fires in the cargo bay of planes. We had the solution. We had these smoke detectors. It was just a simple application of making these smoke detectors required in the cargo bay of planes. And then unfortunately, we had a tragic triggering event, the crash of the Value Jet airliner. Kind of an example of all these streams all converge together, and that's when we tend to make our decisions or make big changes to policies or make big changes the way in which we run our organizations. Another example is the example of welfare reform in the mid-1990s. You had participants in place. You had a Republican-controlled Congress, and you had a Democratic president who was predisposed to changing the nature of the welfare system. You had somewhat agreement over the problem that we were dealing with in the welfare system, and that was a self-perpetuating system where future generations were staying on welfare, and you were having trouble finding work for people and getting people to move from welfare to work. So the solution then was a solution of using block grants. And so in the welfare reform, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, what happened is we replaced AFDC with these new types of grants called Temporary Assistance to Needy Family Grants, or TANF grants. TANF grants were basically block grants. Block grants have been with us for decades and decades and decades. So we are taking a pre-existing solution and we're applying it to a modern day problem. I think we do this a lot again in our organizations. When we have problems with, say, ineffective communication, like a lot of people are talking about in their papers. That's a problem that has been around for a while, but we have solutions to that problem. And, we have solutions to that problem. We have team building exercises to build trust. We have empowerment exercises for employees. Sometimes through the strategic planning process, we can better communicate our goals and our mission to employees within the organization. We've got all these solutions. We're not just creating them brand new. We're not inventing the wheel. We are using solutions that we have been used in the past by our organization and probably other organizations, certainly other organizations as well. The triggering event that may cause us to deal with ineffective communication could be something like it's manifesting in high levels of employee turnover. And so those high levels of employee turnover are the triggering event to make us actually step back and say, well, what's causing this high turnover? And then we identify, well, one of the things is ineffective communication. And then here are these solutions that have already been created that we can then select from in order to try and address this problem. And again, I think that's a common way in which we make a lot of our decisions, both in our organizations as well as the more macro level at the policy level as well. So I'm a big fan of garbage can model decision making. I see it a lot in our organizations. And so I would recommend for you, as you think about your problem, and then you think about the solutions that you are generating for that problem. Think about those solutions from this decision-making type of perspective. Are these rational, comprehensive types of solutions? Are we really looking at all possible alternatives, or is this a more incremental approach? Or can you identify these different streams in the garbage can model decision-making as a really garbage can model decision-making that's most appropriate for addressing this problem and developing these solutions? The type of decision-making model that we rely upon in our organization will have a big impact upon how effective we are at dealing with these problems that we have identified, solving these problems to then make our organizations more effective. So just wanted to throw those 4 different decision-making models out to you if you haven't seen all 4 of them before, and kind of get you a working knowledge of those 4 so you can go back and look at your organization and kind of analyze your organization and see, well, how do we make decisions? Are any of these 4 decision-making models more appropriate for how we are making decisions in this organization? And again, when we talk about especially the comparison between rationality and incrementalism, we really look at them as polar opposites, but the truth of the matter is it depends. It depends upon the problem that we are dealing with. It depends upon the participants involved. It depends upon the solutions that exist. Sometimes we can be very rational in the way in which we deal with it. Sometimes we can be a little bit more incremental. So I would really advise you to look at rationality and incrementalism. This is more of a spectrum, and that there are gradations of rationality in between the being purely rational and being purely incremental. Any questions on those 4 basic models? Again, I'm assuming that you've probably seen them before, at least rationality and incrementalism, if not garbage can. Any questions or observations on those 4 different models? They all seem pretty clear. Okay, good. Then what I'd like to do now is do our normal breakout group type of part of the class. And for this breakout group assignment, I've got a couple of different tasks for each of our groups to do. The first task is I'm going to ask you again, as always, consider your organization. And then think about your organization from the perspective of these 4 different models of effectiveness. And again, this can get you thinking about your organization, the models of effectiveness, so that you can then do your Canvas essay coming up this week. But what model of effectiveness, or models plural of effectiveness, do you see in your organization? How does this model, or how do these models affect how the organization measures effectiveness? And so, talk as a group about the organizations that you each come from, and try and find some commonality in terms of the models of effectiveness that you see across your organizations. And that's part 1. Then when you're done with that, part 2, turn your attention to decision making. What types of decision-making approaches of these 4 models that we have presented up to this point in time, which of these is the dominant approach used in your organization? And again, look for some commonalities. I think you're going to see commonalities between your organizations. And so first thing, what model of effectiveness? Second thing, what model of decision-making? As always, I would ask that each group select a spokesperson, so that after we're done in our breakout groups, we can reconvene as a class and share out what we came up with in our groups. And once we do that, I think that's probably when we will call it a night for this evening. So let's see. Any questions on what we're doing in the breakout groups? Everything pretty clear? You're all used to it by now. So let me go ahead and set up our breakout groups. Let's see, we've got 22. So let's go with, well, we'll go with our 4. 4 has worked for us in the past, so we'll keep going with 4. So let me go ahead and create those 4 groups. Okay, I've created the 4 groups. Let's see, it is 6:55. Let's work on this, we'll say again, for about half an hour. Well, let's just say we'll work on until 7:30. I'll give you to 7:30 to work on it. Then we'll reconvene as a class and we'll see what you came up with. As always, please select one person to present from your group, and we will see what types of similarities and differences we have across the groups. So let me go ahead and open the rooms, and then each group can have at it. So the rooms are now open. Okay, I think we are all back. So let's go ahead and see what we came up with. So how about room number one?
Hi. So for the first part, we discussed our different organizations, and a lot of us had um, goal setting as a main one. But and then it's you're saying it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on on the organization. Um, and for my specific organization, since I work at a private school, so there's definitely an even split between like we're setting our goals, we're achieving our goals, we're trying to do everything to get to okay what our goals do, and then there's also the people pleasing aspect, the participant satisfaction of the board of trustees, the parents, the students, making sure that, oh, they're happy here, making sure that we're not risking any of our monies that come in to support our programs. Um, so there's a good split there. And a couple others in the group talked about like the goals of their organizations. And for the second part, we talked about how a lot of most of our organizations have an even split um, between rational and incrementalism. Um, it depends on the situation. For my school specifically, we do a lot of like specific, like rational decision making approaches, but on like the grand scale, but then like interdepartmentally, like trying to communicate from one department to another, it's more incremental or incrementalism, because information is kind of shared as needed with the people you think need it. But like if a new person is hired, like I was the new person in September and October of last year. People didn't know that I was the person they had to go to for certain things about certain events. So they kept going to the wrong people and information didn't get to me and the event didn't get planned. So like there was that was happening. I mean, it's thankfully it was fixed. Now it's fixed now. But we have other issues. Um, but yeah, that was the grand scheme of it all, is like our organizations, public and private, kind of vary between rational and incremental.
Great. Yeah. And obviously, yeah, I'm a big believer, as you know, it depends. And you're right. I mean, it does depend. And I think a school is a really great example. And especially if you back up to like a school district is a great example of that it depends type of concept, because, the goal attainment model, obviously, here in California, if you're familiar with the way in which schools work, we have requirements of what's called LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan. And in that LCAP, you have to then specify your goals and the strategies for achieving those goals, and then crosswalk those goals and those strategies to the money that it will cost to do those things. And so clearly we're held accountable for achieving goals. And so that's your goal attainment model. And we certainly have systems resource model as well in school districts, and that we need those appropriations from the state, and then you need to have your ADA at whether it's your P1 or P2 ADA, it's got to be at a high enough level so that you can get those resources from the state. And so you're always trying to pull in those resources. You're always trying to hire teachers. You're always trying to hire administrators. And so systems resource makes a lot of sense there as well. Participant satisfaction clearly is a model that we value in schools. And if you've watched any school board meetings during COVID, you know how unsatisfied a lot of parents are when they come to those board meetings. And so, participant satisfaction is important. And then internal processes, you have to have, you are required to have certain internal processes in place. You have to adhere to those internal processes. As a special purpose government, you're held accountable by the County Office of Education and the State Department of Education. You're held accountable for adhering to those processes. Education code, also requires you to adhere to those types of processes as well. And so, yeah, I think we see those 4 models used in school districts very frequently, depending upon what we are doing and what types of um, processes we're managing, or what types of external constituents we're dealing with, and so on and so on. And I think, also the it depends, I think applies very well to decision-making models as well. And I think rational, comprehensive, incrementalism, again, we kind of look at that spectrum. We're a little less rational on this topic, maybe a little bit more rational on this topic, and it really does certainly depend. So, excellent. Very good. Okay, how about group number 2?
So we were all over the place. We each had different models, and for mine it was internal process approach, because our executive team really cares about trying to be as transparent as possible and having everybody involved in measuring effectiveness, so that we know how we're being evaluated and we have a say in it. And I do see how that improves the participation, and we're more invested in the work that we do when we hold ourselves accountable for it. And it's not just the supervisors who hold us accountable for it. And then for decision making, we also had different thoughts about that, but we agreed that we didn't really know how the decisions were made. For example, for mine, I thought it was like the mixed scanning, because like the smaller decisions were open for everyone's input, and we all felt that we had a part in it. But at the end of the day, it was up to the executive team to make bigger decisions, or even the smaller decisions, to agree on that. And we didn't know how the executive teams make those decisions.
Very good. Yeah, and I think you've got 2 really important points there that you made. The first important point is bringing leadership into it. And I think that's a very important point, that the type of model of effectiveness and how we define effectiveness, a lot of that flows from leadership. And so leadership kind of decides what is effectiveness, and kind of decides how to measure effectiveness. I think that's a really important point. And in a couple of weeks, when we spend an entire week talking about leadership and organizational effectiveness, we'll really cover that topic. And I think you're right. Leadership oftentimes defines those types of things for us. And then the second important point that you made, I think, is it really boils down to communication, and that these leaders are making the big decisions tend to be made at executive management levels. The smaller day-to-day types of task-oriented decisions may be made lower in the organization, but oftentimes the vast majority of employees in the organization don't know how those big decisions are being made by executive management. And sometimes that certainly, number 1, causes some frustration, and number 2, also reduces and erodes the amount of buy-in that members of the organization have for those decisions made at that executive management, that executive leadership type of stage. And that's something from an academic world I see at a university all the time, when decisions are made at the provost level, or if they're made at the dean level, but there's not a whole lot of insight into how those decisions are made, or why those decisions were made. It really does erode the buy-in on the part of the rest of the organization. So I think those are excellent points. So great, thank you very much. Group number 3.
Okay. Our group had a discussion. We figured out we're all over the board as well. But the one thing we found consensus in was in the participant satisfaction model, because we're all kind of service oriented. And in the second part, we looked at we all felt that the rational decision model best met our group, because we're all really a data-driven group. We ask questions: does the mission meet the needs of our constituencies? What services do we provide? Do we use surveys? How do people benefit from our services? That's what our group came up with.
Thank you, Mary. And yes, participant satisfaction, that's always going to be an important one in the public sector, where we always have to keep our constituents happy, meet the needs of our constituents. I mean, that's why we do what we do to begin with, is to meet the needs of our citizens. And Robert Merton tells us, the primary goal of an organization is to have the consequences on its beneficiaries that it needs to have. So, meeting the wants, needs, and desires of beneficiaries. And so again, that's, that's something that's inherent to the public sector, in across the entire public sector, regardless of organization. And I think that you make a good point about the organizations are very data driven. That is going to probably lead us more toward the rationality type of decision making model, because you've got that quantitative data that you can then collect and you can then use to make your decisions. So you are going to be much more empirical and probably be more likely to be rational, comprehensive than if you weren't as data driven. And so I think the role of data is a really important qualifier for the entire discussion. So great, thank you very much. And how about group number 4?
Okay, that would be me, Amber. So we as a group, we're all working at the public sector level. So we also found that there's the participant satisfaction model that exists. For example, I know that William had mentioned that in Santa Monica, there's a lot of community outreach and having the community involved to gather data. The same with the County of Santa Barbara. I work for behavioral wellness. We provide services. We gather so much data from the community especially during our board hearings that are open to the public to decide if the goals are being met. So there's also the goal orientation approach, the goal approach. Each department has their own goals, which creates a potential muddling of information. Also, we all found that there's a hierarchy of approval that, similar to what others have discussed, the executive at the top make the decisions. There's a lack of communication. Essentially, the decision-making process starts as rational, where they come up with rational goals, but it ends up being incremental because of all of the stakeholder approval, the political aspects of approval that essentially bottlenecks the process. So what happens is there are goals that are created, the information's collected from the community, a rational approach is created to meet these goals, and then all the red tape creates it to where only incremental changes can be made.
Excellent.
I hope I was correct in that assessment.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me in that, in terms of the participant satisfaction model. Today, we are so much more capable of getting feedback from our citizens than we ever were in the past. And I know maybe a lot of your cities use the government outreach app, the Geo app, or some other type of app that really connects you to citizens, and so citizens can put in service requests or lodge complaints or suggestions or things such as that straight through the app. And I think that does obviously open those lines of communication a lot more than what we had in the past, so that we almost instantaneously know that if someone's needs are not being met, we know that. And so if they put in a graffiti complaint, we've got the GPS, so we know exactly where that's at, and they don't even have to tell us because we know where that request is coming from. So I do think we're much more connected, and that obviously places much more of an emphasis on the participant satisfaction type of model. And I think you make an outstanding point with your second point, which is how best laid plans. And so our best laid plans are that we try and be rational when we're making these changes to policy and making these decisions, but because of the hierarchy, because of a lot of the points of approval, that rational decision-making process actually ends up becoming more incremental as it works its way through the processes and through the organization. That in a classical organization with all the written rules and regulations and policies and procedures and different points of approval, sometimes it's difficult for us to be rational, and we actually end up wanting to be rational, but we end up operating, acting much more incremental in nature. I think that's an outstanding point. So very well done. Great. I think all 4 groups, again, I think the takeaways from this, number one, it depends. it depends on the organization, depends upon the issue, depends upon the leadership in that organization, what model of effectiveness is to be used. And then number two, the models of effectiveness are not mutually exclusive, and we can see them used in combination in very much of a hybrid approach. I think in terms of the decision-making models, I think it's important to recognize, again, the role of leadership in terms of making those decisions. And then I think that last point that the fourth group made is that even when we try and be rational, sometimes because of the restrictions and limitations imposed upon us by being a bureaucratic organization, we're not able to be as rational as we otherwise would like to be. So very well done. Again, I hope that it's a useful exercise for you to do this so that you can share between your organizations, because there are similarities and there are differences. But hopefully what we do here in the breakout groups helps you think through some of the things you're going to be doing in your assignments, and especially in your upcoming Canvas essay. So speaking of that, your next Canvas essay, as we mentioned, will be basically the first part of this breakout group assignment, where you'll be looking at your organization, talking about the models of effectiveness that you see used in your organization. And then also, if you have not yet submitted your alternative solutions paper, if you could get that in by tonight, and I will read those tomorrow and get some feedback to you, hopefully by tomorrow evening before I step into my next class on Tuesday night. So that should get us going then and get us through week number 5. Then we get back together next Monday in week 6. We will devote the entire session to motivation, motivational theories, and motivational concepts. Same type of approach. We'll present information in the first half of class and then use our breakout groups in the second half of class to apply that information to our organizations. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here tonight, and I look forward to talking to you again next Monday. Hope everyone has a great week, and I will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.